So when we look at the book of Colossians, I need to give you a little quick historical background thing here before we can actually look at the one text I want to look at and put it in its proper context. I would think that one of the most, and I'm sure that you all probably already know all about this because Brother Craig has made sure that you would have this. And if I recall correctly, I think it may have actually come up in the debate, and everyone remembers everything that was said in the debate 5 years ago. So, because I'm sure you watch it, at least once a week, just to keep it fresh. But I've actually never even watched it, so don't feel bad if you didn't, because I was there. I went through it once, didn't want to necessarily go through it again. But anyway, the background of the book of Colossians, I think, is important for you to understand, especially this first chapter, because scholars have looked at this, and if you read through it, you see that Paul's talking about this worshiping of angels and people who think that they sort of are doing something that's religiously good by denying their physical bodies, and there's something going on, and what's going on here? Well, most people believe, and I think it fits accurately, that what's going on is coming into the churches. And remember, Paul didn't found the church at Colossae. This was sort of a second-generation church. He had founded the church in Ephesus. The gospel goes up the Lycus River Valley, and lo and behold, a church is founded there. And so this is sort of how the church is going to be spreading. And it's off more to the east. And coming out of the east, you had something that eventually would be known in its fullest form as Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism, if you want to insult somebody in a really cool, scholarly way, you go, "Hey man, you sound like a Gnostic," and they'll go, "What?" And in seminary, it's really cool to do that. It's almost never accurate, but we do have a few Gnostics running around. Oprah Winfrey gets into Gnosticism every once in a while, but anyway, she gets into pretty much everything at some point or another. But Gnosticism, I'll have to be very brief about this, but Gnosticism is basically a dualistic system. That which is physical is evil. That which is spiritual is good. And so man's problem is you are good on the inside. Your spiritual self is good, but you're trapped in this evil body. And salvation is to get out of this evil body and to be that spark of the divine within you to be absorbed back into the one. Sort of sounds a little bit Star Wars-ish and a few things like that. So there's elements to that. But to be absorbed back into the one. The Greeks were dualists, and that's why when Paul on Mars Hill talks about the resurrection of the dead, he uses the term anastasis, that which died coming to life again. They mock him because the whole idea of salvation is not that which died coming to life again. It's if it died, you want to keep it dead, and you want to let the spirit get out and be absorbed back into the one and find its true self in the one great being, etc., etc. And so by the 2nd century, there was this fully developed Gnostic concept where you had the idea that people had said, well, if God's all good and matter's all evil, then how did the world get created? And so they came up with this idea that there are all these intermediary beings that come down from God. And as each one gets a little bit farther, a little bit farther, a little bit farther away from God, finally you get down to a being called a demiurge that's still divine and still has divine power, but it's far enough removed from God now that it can become evil and create the physical world. And so the Gnostics eventually would believe that the God of the Old Testament was an evil God because he was the creator of all things, and that the God who created the world was very different than the God, the Father of Jesus. And so they had all these intermediary beings, by the way, were called the pleroma, the fullness. And you'll notice that Paul uses the term fullness a number of times, even in Colossians chapter 1. He's using their language against them. And they were also, because they also had to ask the question, well, if that which is physical is evil, then how could Jesus have been a fully good person, and yet he was physical? And so that actually, very early on, people developed the idea of what's called Docetism, from the Greek term dakein. It seems they were the ones that would tell stories about how Jesus would be walking along with the disciple along the seashore, and the disciple turns around, and there's only one set of footprints. It's not that corny poem about, well, it's because it was a tough time and Jesus carried me. No, that's a whole different weird unbiblical thing. But anyway, it was because Jesus doesn't leave footprints in sand because he only seems to have a physical body. Dachain, seems to have a physical body. And so you'll notice, for example, that John is very concerned about this. That's why in 1 John, that which we have seen with our eyes, which we've handled with our hands concerning the word of life. And what does he say is the Antichrist in 1 John? Anyone who denies what? That Jesus has come in the flesh. And so this is a very early heresy, an early falsehood that is being taught and that the church had to struggle against. And it had its roots within this dualistic, Gnostic type of thinking. And it would become one of the primary enemies of the Christian church in the 2nd century. In fact, a guy around 150-ish flourished in Rome by the name of Marcion. And Marcion was a Gnostic heretic. And for the next 150 years, if you were a Christian writer, you wrote a book against Marcion. I mean, we've lost track of how many books were written against Marcion. He was the most popular guy to write a book against for a very, very long time. And that's what the church was fighting against. Well, Paul is warning against an early form of this as he writes to the Colossians.